He had not asked her name before she climbed down from the wagon. That was the first thing she noticed about him. Most men asked right away. It was the first thing they did, as if the name settled something, put a person in their proper place. He had not. He lifted her trunk from the back, set it on the ground beside the fence post, and walked back to the horse without a word. She stood there in the August dust and watched him lead the animal toward the barn, and she thought, either he already knows, or he does not care, and she could not yet tell which. The house was unfinished on the north side. She saw that before she saw anything else, the framing exposed, the boards not yet gone up, a tarp nailed at one corner and left to lift in the wind. The rest of the house was tight enough. Someone had taken care with the south-facing wall. The window frames were true. The porch boards did not give under her weight. But the north side was open to whatever came, and something had come through, she could tell. A season at least, maybe two, had worked at the wood that was there and softened it along the bottom rail. She picked up the small bag she carried herself and went to the door. Inside, the kitchen had a table and 2 chairs, and a cast-iron stove that was newer than the rest of it. There was a shelf with tins, a hook for a coat, a window above the basin that looked out toward the tree line. Spruce mostly, and one birch that had grown up crooked and then corrected itself half-way, the trunk bending and then going straight again, as if it had decided partway through to make something of itself. She set her bag on the table and did not sit. She had been told there was work here through a woman in town, Mrs. Havelock, who kept the post office and knew everyone's business and most of their difficulties. The arrangement was simple. She would help with the build through autumn. There was a room off the back, small, with a cot and a hook and a square of window that faced east. She had seen worse. She had lived in worse. He came in without knocking, which made sense because it was his house, and he went to the stove and checked something in the pot that had been sitting there. He was tall in the way that men who work outdoors go tall. Not from standing up straight, but from having to reach things and carry things until the body simply adjusts. His hands were rough at the knuckle. He had a way of moving through the kitchen that suggested he had learned the dimensions of it exactly and did not need to think about them anymore. He said the well was around the east side, and the pump needed 3 strokes before it gave. He said supper was at 6. He said the tools were in the lean-to, and she was not to leave them on the ground overnight, because the dew got into the handles. She said she understood. He looked at her then. Really looked. The way people did when they were trying to figure out how much trouble a thing was going to be. She held still and let him. Then he nodded and went back outside. The first morning she was up before him, which she could tell because the lamp in the lean-to was still dark. She found the tools where he had said they would be. She found the pile of boards he had milled and stacked under canvas at the side of the lean-to. Good spruce, straight-grained, not yet cupped. She ran her hand along one, and it was dry. He had done that right at least, stacking them with the weight on the bottom and leaving air between. She looked at the north wall in the early light. The problem was the sill plate, the bottom rail she had noticed the night before. 2 sections of it had gone soft, where water had pooled from a roof that overhung wrong. Everything above it was sound, but the sill needed to come out before anything else went on. You could not build on a weak base and pretend it would hold. She had seen men do it, it never held. She had the first section of bad sill out by the time he came around the corner of the house with a mug in one hand. He stopped. She kept working. The second section came loose in 2 pulls, and she set it on the ground beside the first, both of them dark with rot at the inner face, the outer face still looking almost fine. That was the thing about rot. It started from the inside. He came closer and crouched down to look at what she had pulled. He said, "I was going to sister the new boards alongside," she said. "It wouldn't have held." He turned one of the bad sections over in his hands, pressed his thumb into the soft part, and it gave the way bread gives. He set it down. She said, "The ledger board is fine, and the studs above the first 2 feet. I'll check the rest." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll get the other mug." She did not know what to do with that, so she went back to checking the studs. He was not a man who explained himself. She gathered this slowly, the way you gather most things about people who don't talk much. In pieces, through what they did instead of what they said. He fed the barn cat before he fed himself. She noticed this on the third morning, saw him come out of the barn with the empty dish, and she recalibrated something in her assessment of him without quite knowing what. He had a habit of standing still at the end of a task, just for a moment, before moving on to the next one. Not resting standing, the way a person does when they are checking some internal list. She recognized it because she did the same thing, had done it since she was young, and trying to keep track of a life that had a tendency to slip. On the fourth day, she found a child's boot behind the door of the small room where she slept. It was a small boot, worn at the toe and patched at the heel with a piece of leather that had been stitched carefully, more carefully than the original. She turned it over in her hands. The stitching was his. She could tell by the tension of it, the same even pressure she had seen in the way he joined boards. Nothing loose, nothing showing off. She set it on the windowsill and did not mention it. The rhythm of the work was something she had not expected to like as much as she did. She had worked alongside people before, on her uncle's property outside of Antigonish, and later, briefly, with a crew repairing a dock in Pictou, and it had always felt like negotiation. Who went where? Whose way was right? The small daily arguments that men had about methods when what they were really arguing about was something else entirely. He was not like that. He had a way of working beside her that was simply work. He took one side of a board, and she took the other, and they lifted, and the board went where it needed to go. When she held a stud in place and he nailed it, he did not say anything to her, and she did not say anything to him, and the stud went in straight. When she had a better angle on a cut, she took it, and he stepped back, and when he had a better angle, she moved without being asked. On the sixth morning, she thought, this is what it is supposed to feel like. She had not thought that in a long time. Years, maybe. She had not let herself. Her husband had been a decent man, and then he had been a sick man, and then he had been gone. The farm in Cape Breton had been sold to cover what he owed, and she had taken the trunk and the small bag and the skills she had learned from her father, who had been a carpenter in Truro before the mill closed, and something went out of him that he never quite got back. She had learned from watching him, first, and then from doing, and she had found that her hands knew things her mind had not formally been told. She did not talk about any of this. There was nothing to be gained from talking about it. The town was 7 miles east on a road that was good in summer and disagreeable in everything else. She went in on a Thursday with the list he had written on the back of a feed receipt: 2 pounds of 10-penny nails, linseed oil, a new draw knife if Elspeth at the hardware had one in, and salt pork if the price was reasonable. Elspeth did not have a draw knife. She had a narrow woman's face and a way of looking at a person that sorted them into categories without any apparent effort. She said, "You'd be the one out at the Vance place." She said yes. Elspeth said, "He's had a time of it," and left it at that, which was either discretion or a test, and she was not going to take the bait either way. She bought the nails and the oil and the salt pork at a price that was fine and carried it back out to where she'd left the horse. A man named Puttycombe was coming out of the feed store across the road. She knew his names because he introduced himself to everyone within 30 feet and apparently had been doing so for years. He was the kind of man who filled a silence as a reflex, not from friendliness, but from a low tolerance for quiet. He said, "Good morning, miss. You working out at the Vance place?" She said yes. He said, "He's a private sort." And then he said several other things that she did not retain because she was already thinking about the angle of the north gable and whether the new sheathing would need an additional course of blocking. She drove back on the road with the afternoon light coming sideways through the trees and the birches going gold at the edges where the cold had already started working on them. On the 9th day, the child arrived. She had heard vaguely that there was a daughter, not from him, but from something Elspeth had not quite said in the hardware store. A pause in the conversation where the word daughter would have fit. She had filed it away and not looked at it directly. The girl came on a neighbor's wagon, small and serious-faced, with her hair in 2 plaits and a canvas bag that she carried herself. She was perhaps 7, or perhaps older. She had the face of a child who had learned to make herself useful and so looked more settled than her years. She climbed down from the wagon before the neighbor had fully stopped it, and she walked to the door of the house, and she went in. The neighbor, a woman with two of her own children in the back, Mrs. Edgewick, who would come to matter later in a different way, said, "She's been at my place since the start of the month." He said she'd be ready to come home when the room was done. She looked at the house. The small room off the back, the window that faced east, the cot, the hook, she said. "The room is done." Mrs. Edgewick nodded and turned the wagon around and went back down the road. Inside, the girl was at the table with her bag open, taking out her things with the careful efficiency of someone who had learned to pack and unpack and knew how to make a space their own quickly. A book, a small tin, cloth horse with button eyes, one eye larger than the other because they had been replaced at different times. She stood in the doorway and said, "I'm in the big room now. I moved my things this morning." The girl looked up. She had his eyes, the direct kind that looked and then looked away and then came back, as if one look was not quite enough to know a thing. She said, "There's a boot on the windowsill in the east room." She said, "It was there when I arrived. I left it for you." The girl considered this. Then she nodded, and she went back to her cloth horse. That evening he made a stew that was better than she had expected. The girl ate with them and did not speak much, but she was not a silent child. She made small observations at intervals, the kind of observations that children make when they have spent too much time among adults and have learned to contribute rather than demand attention. She said the stew needed something and then could not name what it was. He said, "Time." She said, "We're out." He said, "I know." The girl looked between them. She said, "Mrs. Edgewick puts bay leaves." He said, "Then we're making do without." The girl nodded as if this were perfectly acceptable. She ate the rest of her stew. She watched all of this from her side of the table and thought, here is a man who knows what is missing and does not pretend it is not missing. He simply makes do. There is a whole life you could build on that. Then she looked at her bowl and kept eating. Cold came at the end of the third week. The real cold, not the edge-of-season cold she had been feeling at mornings, but the kind that settled in by noon and stayed. The kind that meant something. She had kind that knew its cool. It came from the northwest in this part of the province, off the water eventually, and it had a weight to it that the southern cold did not have. They closed in the north wall in 2 days. It was the best 2 days of work she had done in a long time. The boards went up clean, the sheathing courses lined up at the corners, and she cut the window opening with the saw going steady and the line staying true. He worked from a scaffold he had built on the first day. Simple, 3 uprights and 2 planks, solid as anything she had tested, and she worked from the ground and from the lowest level. And they traded the chalk line back and forth without saying much. On the second evening, when the last board was up and the wall was tight, she stood back and looked at it. It was a good wall. It would stop whatever came at it. She heard him come up beside her. He stood there in the November dark with the light from the kitchen window, making a yellow square on the ground between them, and he looked at the wall the same way she was looking at it, not with pride exactly, but with the particular satisfaction of a thing that had been wrong and was now right. He said, "Thank you," she said. "It needed doing." He said, "Still." She looked at the wall for another moment. Then, she said, "The fascia on the south eave is pulling away. I noticed it last week. It'll need to come down and be reset before the snow gets into it." He was quiet a moment. Then he said, "I'll get the ladder in the morning." She nodded. They went inside. The girl had made tea in the slightly inexact way of children who had been shown once and retained the general principle. It was too strong by half. They both drank it without comment. She taught the girl how to measure the water to the right level. "Just below the 3rd mark on the inside of the pot," she explained, because the 3rd mark was where the tea stopped tasting like dishwater without starting to taste like a decision. The girl asked where she had learned that. She said her father had taught her. The girl asked where her father was. She said he had died some years ago in a town called Truro on a Tuesday in February when the light was very flat and the ground was frozen. The girl looked at this information seriously. She said, "My mother died in April." She said, "I know." The girl said, "April is better, I think. There are more things to look at." She thought about this. She said, "That's a good way to think about it." The girl poured the rest of her tea into the basin. It was honestly too strong, and took her book and went to the east room. And she could hear, A few minutes later, the sound of the girl talking quietly to the cloth horse, explaining something in the particular tone of a person who was working through something they had not yet solved. She sat at the table with her tea and did not drink it. He was on the porch. She could see the shape of him through the window, just standing, looking at the tree line the way he sometimes did in the evenings when the day had been used up, and there was nothing left that needed saying. She thought, I could leave in the spring. The work would be done by then, or close enough. She could go back to Pictou or further. There was talk of work out in Manitoba, a cousin of Mrs. Havelock's who was building. She had never been that far west. She had never been much further than she'd started. She thought, I could leave. She drank the tea. It was, as the girl had correctly determined, too strong. The fascia took a day and a half. He held the sections steady from the ladder, and she worked from the scaffold they rebuilt for that side, and by noon of the second day the eave was tight and the flashing was set, and there was nothing in the joint for water to get into. She was on her way down the scaffold when one of the planks shifted. Not badly, not dangerously, but enough that she caught herself on the upright and came down slower. He was already at the base of it with his hand on the plank, steadying what did not need steadying anymore. She stepped off the bottom rung and he was close, the way a person is when they have moved towards something quickly without thinking about how close it would put them. She was aware of him the way she had not let herself be before. She stepped back. She bent down and picked up the chisel she had set on the ground before climbing. She examined the blade as if it needed examining. He said, plank shifted. She said, I noticed. He said, I should have checked it better. She said, so should I. She straightened up and looked at the eave. It was clean. It was joint, she said. He looked at the joint. Then he looked at her. He said, you know what you're doing. She said, yes. He said, I know. He stopped. He looked at the ground the way he did sometimes when a thought did not come out the way he had wanted it to. He tried again. He said, it's been good, having someone who knows. She waited. He said, I don't mean just the building. The wind came through the spruce at the edge of the property. The birch was almost bare now, just a few leaves holding on at the upper branches, the pale ones, the ones that always held longest. She said, I might stay on through winter. He looked at her. She said, the barn siding needs attention, and I looked at the foundation on the east end. There's some pointing to do before it freezes hard. He said, that's not nothing. She said, no. He nodded slowly the way he did when he had decided something that he intended to keep. He said, the girl would like that. She said, I know. She picked up her tools. She carried them to the lean-to and hung them on their hooks and set the chisel on the shelf with the blade up, out of the way. She stood for a moment in the lean-to, looking at the tools in their places, and she thought about how a thing looked when it was where it belonged. Then she went inside to start supper. Through the window, she could see the north wall, solid, boarded tight, nothing the winter could find its way through. She had built that. They had built it. She was not sure anymore where the line was, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not need to find it. The stove took on the first try. She put the pot on and found the salt pork and thought about time, and whether the town store might have it, and whether the road would be passable by Thursday. It would be. She had seen worse roads. She had driven worse in worse weather with less reason to come back. This was a better road, and she had reasons now, more than one and growing.